America loses a war in Iraq, and the Iraqi Navy sails up the Potomac, and they ask for George Bush II to be handed over to them so that they can have him stand trial in Den Haag. Yeah, that is completely inconceivable, as everybody knows. So they can do what they want.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello everyone, a big welcome back to BungaCast. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, joined by Lee Jones in London. Hello Lee.
Hi Alex.
And an especially big welcome back to Wolfgang Streeck. Hello, how are you Wolfgang? Where are you joining us from?
Thank you, I'm in Cologne, thanks.
Excellent. So today, as you listener may have guessed, we're talking about Wolfgang Streeck's work, and in particular, his book, Taking Back Control, ? States and State Systems After Globalism, which came out in English translation at the end of last year from Verso. So we're honored to have Wolfgang back on, of course, for the first time since 2021. I hadn't realized it had been quite that long. It's been 40 years. For listeners, in the slim chance that they're not aware, they're not familiar with your work, Wolfgang is an economic sociologist and emeritus director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. You will have previously heard Wolfgang on this podcast back in 2021, episode 218, if you'd like to look that up, Stability über alles. And then in 2020, episode 160, Enemies of the People, Large and Very Small. You may guess what that refers to. Some of those are microbes. That was in the midst of the pandemic where we spoke to Wolfgang, I think, for the first time on this podcast. So if listeners want to go check that out, it's linked to in the show notes. Now, regular listeners of this podcast will know that we have, since the very start, been concerned with the breakdown of the neoliberal order and what comes next. We've been exploring these questions since 2017, which I recall actually is when Wolfgang's book, excellent book, Buying Time, came out, at least in English as well. But much has evolved since then. So I just want to cite a couple of phenomena very briefly, because these will in some ways frame the discussion I think that we're going to have. So the advance of so-called populists into government across Europe and beyond, the phenomenon of globalization going into reverse, the fragmentation of trade, so-called friendshoring, and increasingly protectionist policies. And then the threat and also, of course, the reality of war, in particular, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And these are themes, of course, that are dispersed throughout the book. This episode is hugely important to us in its own right, because the book is excellent and one of the most important works of political economy of the past decade. But also because it forms part of an ongoing investigation into and discussion of the world in 2025, the return of Trump, and much more. So in future months, just to signal this, we intend to have as guests Ila Salami on state capitalism, Jamie Merchant on economic nationalism and global decline, and much else besides. So this is part of an ongoing discussion, but I'm very excited to get into it with Wolfgang just now. So I'm going to actually hand the matter over to Lee right now.
Yes, and as Alex, we were talking before we came on air about how we're going to run the episode to make it a bit easier for listeners and make it manageable. I thought what we would do is start by summarising the book. I'll have a go at summarising the book. You can jump in, Wolfgang, and tell me when I've got it wrong. Because I think a lot of the ground that you cover, the analytical ground that you cover, is very familiar to listeners of BungaCast. And I was also struck, actually, how you end up in a very similar place to where we ended up in our book, Taking Control, Sovereignty and Democracy After Brexit. So just to give us more time to focus on your proposals about where we go from where we are, if I kind of run through the argument of the book about exactly where we are, you argue that the world is in the grip of a dual crisis. So firstly, a crisis of capitalist growth, which has trended downwards since the 1980s neoliberal revolution, despite various desperate attempts to reboot growth. And you say capitalism's wizards are now clueless and out of ideas. And secondly, an associated crisis of democracy as governance was de-democratized and shunted upwards into intergovernmental or supranational forums to embed neoliberal rules, which has resulted in the hollowing out of democracy and widespread discontent, which is now expressed in populist rebellions. And as you see the current impasse, we're in this deadlocked struggle between the failed globalists who've been trying to push governance upwards and the populists who want to shunt it back downwards to the nation state level. And you argue that the task today is to hasten this downwards restoration of the sovereign democratic nation states and to engage in deglobalization. And you argue very patiently with people who won't like that argument that the upwards vision has failed. It's doomed to fail. It can't be pursued today. One of the most original aspects of the book is this engagement with the politics of scale. And you argue the larger a polity becomes, the less is its capacity to address the diversity of interests, challenges, and cultures in the human societies it tries to govern. Imposing uniform rules only creates a mismatch with local conditions, which spurs resistance. And so a megastate like the EU, and I think you often have the EU in mind when you talk about megastates, has either got to change the rules and abandon its quest for uniformity or use force to impose its will. And what is called the liberal international order, you say, it got stuck. It never became this global superstate because of all these difficulties. So it got stuck at the level of regulatory networks, very fragile, backed by US imperial power. And you argue that efforts to move things upwards today just don't have any real vitality. We see that in the EU. So you say the only way out of this deadlock and this stagnation is downwards. The restoration of what you call Keynesian Polanyian states that can subordinate capital and economic calculus to social requirements. And you say that will require both radical democracy and cultural revolution. And you don't want to spell out exactly how we might get there, but you do have a kind of manifesto, if you like, for economic democracy. Things like shortening supply chains, economic protectionism and autarky, prioritizing domestic investment and growth and consumption, building up the foundational economy of infrastructure and public services, domesticating capital, and adapting monetary systems to social requirements. So tell me if I got any of that wrong.
No. I think the core is that and you're rendering this very clearly. What looks like what may look to some like a sort of recipe making book is not really one that sort of suggests a general path to happiness, but it conveys a certain sort of, if you want, heuristic principle. If you look at the crises of today, rather than automatically jumping to the conclusion that they have to be resolved at the global or European or whatever central level, first try out whether there is a potential there for them being more productively addressed at a lower level, where you return power to the people, if you. Yeah, the centralized world is one in which power goes to an elite of either technocrats or political geniuses, like they were sitting in Moscow in the interwar years, where they knew exactly how to run a revolution in Italy and in China and where else, always along the same principles, because these principles had once and for all be established by a Marxist science. And Gramsci was one who tried to explain to the Muscovites that there was something wrong with this idea when it came to Italy, for example. You could say it was also wrong when it came to Germany, as you remember. So the point is that I begin to think about, as you say, a sort of political theory of scale, and there, let's say, the sacrifice of closeness to real life on the ground that is involved in transferring political competences to some central agency that sacrifice is not justified in most cases because the policy that central agency can produce is very likely not adequate to many of the problems that societies today are, or societies generally are dealing with. Yeah. So I use the term technocracy. You can also say marketocracy. Sometimes I use the term juristocracy, where you have sort of a European court which knows exactly what sort of immigration policy European societies need and can politically make feasible. Yes, so even a global market with all this distributed intelligence, as Hayek would call it, can work only if it is not instituted from the center in a uniform way for everyone, regardless of what their local conditions are. That in many many ways, these sort of centralists, centralists, globalists, remind me of neoclassical economists who have a universal recipe for everyone in the world. Only that if you try to apply that recipe, people at the end very often do less well than they did at the beginning. Yes, I became very suspicious of this sort of universalism, and my general hypothesis would be try to think about something special if something goes wrong, rather than of a universal recipe. Now, let me add one more point to this. I never was a great plan maker, so to speak, for the world. So I'm not saying that now we go and carve up Russia into 4 or the United States into 50 small states. But where you have large states, my advice would be, if you want to keep them united without having to engage in civil war, federalism could be a very nice idea. That is to institute more local capacity to make decisions than in a centralized regime. And then, of course, we begin to think about, do small states, do states with more autonomy, do they do better? Now I think evidence is accumulating that over-centralized countries, like I venture to say the United Kingdom is certainly, sort of tend to neglect their areas where people really need help. Whereas a country like Denmark, we're now a country like Denmark, which is in the European Union, but insists on its own currency, so it can have a monetary policy of its own, very often sort of was able to get exceptions from centralized European policies. They're doing very well, and the country is ranks number 1 in this sort of ridiculous world happiness ranking. But anyway, if they seem to be above average happy with their state and with their politics, although they do not have any more hegemonic politics. Final point. What I'm trying to do in this book is to look at internal state structure and external international structures, interstate structures, with the same logic. So if you want a global world, then you will have to have a global center where the universalism is imposed on the world. And in the last 30 years, this was the United States. Now look at what became of the United States in 30 years. I lived in the United States in 1990. It was still a reasonably well-functioning society, yes. And also look at what this centralized governance, which allegedly was won by rules, but de facto it was won by one country that could break the rules anytime they wanted to. that what that produced in terms of the condition of the world. And there always I say, let's think about more autonomy, decentralization, federalism as our first hunch when we try to think about a problem, and then see whether that would logically make sense.
Now, despite all that, you say in the preface, you start with a gloomy note. You say the revival of nation-state democracy is possible, although not very probable.
Yeah.
Why do you say that?
Yeah, because now the fundamental problem in revising the current makeup of political economy is that in the last 30 years we have separated the running of the economy from democracy. The neoliberal world was, in a very general sense, one in which democracy became something, let's say, in which this thing called the economy was sort of treated as a prosperity generating mechanism that you can leave to its own devices, and then it would work. And politics could consider itself with identity, with sort of general rules of justice, or things you find in sociology books these days, the recipe that it is a problem of recognition, that you have a declining working class, and if you culturally give them more recognition and don't despise them anymore, less contempt, more friendliness, then that's democracy. But democracy, in order to function in a capitalist environment, must have a capacity to redistribute. It must have a capacity to run the economy in terms of more justice, not just the society. And in fact, democracy has to be capable of mediating an agreement between capital and labor, that cooperation of labor with capital could take place and has to take place with a few rules that labor imposes through democracy on capital. Like you please stay here rather than go away if you don't like us anymore. You please pay your bloody taxes, and rather than, like in the last 30 years, the corporate income tax sort of goes down everywhere, because the mobility of capital has increased. In other words, democracy must be an instrument to impose rules on capital. Capital, after all, is the result of what people have produced on a given territory, and then that thing sort of should be available to some extent, at least, not just for generating more private profit, but for doing something useful for the society that ultimately is the producer of that stuff, right? That's the underlying idea. I get very nervous if people talk about democracy in abstract terms, like Habermas. Habermas has become so disjointed from what is really going on in the world. Yeah, an enlightened debate between citizens. Yeah, where is this taking place? So my example for where are the most elevated discussions on democracy as social justice, unity, debate, and so on, in two places, Athens and Virginia. These were both slave owner society. These were both where those that are doing the work had no voice in these wonderful debates. Jefferson wrote all this wonderful stuff, and there was his second wife in the in the basement, which was his slave. Yeah, and then to me, the answer to this is that we can talk about democracy only in the context of a historical place and time in which democracy assumes different meanings. Not the Athenian meaning of whether we go to war or not. That can play a role, but not in a meeting of citizens. Here in our societies, it must be deeply involved with the mode of production that society has developed, and with the way in which what people produce is used later for them or for others, who owns it, and so all of this must be deeply the subject of democratic policy, and not just of debate, because after all, the division between what is surplus value appropriated by those who own the means of production, and that which is allocated to maintain a working class, that division cannot be decided on general principles. 80% for capital, 20 for workers, or the other way around. It is decided in conflict and in a power struggle. The book basically tries to say that if you want democracy, you have to have optimal conditions for a power struggle, for a power distribution in which labor is able to impose conditions on capital, rather than the other way around. And where is the sort of political organization in which this is best possible? That is the question for me. What is democracy?
But is this what makes it unrealistic today, or you say it's possible but not very probable? Is just that the balance between labor and capital is so skewed?
Yeah, and then we all have to say two things. First of all, that is the case, and secondly, we want to continue to live as a society in this world. If you ask me, the book is sort of not very optimistic, but if I had been pessimistic already at that time, I would have started with the following story. Capitalism is a political, economic, social regime that has been changing dramatically since it became a major factor in social life. End of the 18th century, I would say. Yeah, and how did it change? The most important changes were in wars, through war. The defeat of the Netherlands by the English sort of moved the center of capital from the Netherlands, from the Golden Age, to London. And then Napoleonic conquest sort of awakened Germany as a potentially modern nation. Yeah, we're historically proud of the Prussian reforms after the defeat against Napoleon. Then the First World War. The First World War basically was the end of the feudal or post-feudal empires, which were unable to govern their societies, and their replacement by nation states. The Second World War was basically a continuation of the First World War, because capitalism wasn't able to develop some sort of regime. Only Keynes in 1944 had an idea of how you can link sovereign nations in a global context without destroying their political autonomy, or the remnants of their political autonomy. The Americans weren't quite convinced. They had a different idea, but Keynes had this idea that you can have autonomy in a regular in a system that has rules. And now after the end of the Cold War, which was another sort of end of a war, if you want, the neoliberal era is sort of basically over, because all the promises that were made, none of the promises have been kept. Now, where's the war that can reorganize can sort of all this debt that has been accumulated in dollar? It can never be paid back. You need a war to extinguish indebtedness. So there, I would think, if I read what the American military or strategic debate does, what they are thinking about basically this guy Thukydides, who was the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, who explained the defeat of Athens by the fact that Athens did not attack Sparta early enough, that they had been waiting too long. They had been watching this state rising up without intervening. Let's not make the mistake that led to the defeat in the Peloponnesian War. That's something that you find in the United States in quite a few circles.
Hmm. So we might come back to war later on, but I did want to ask something which I was actually initially going to ask about whether this argument for the revival of nation-state democracy and the nation-state as the only possible container for democracy understood as power struggle, whether this was really an argument about the EU and the correct scale of politics within Europe, within the European continent. But actually, there's maybe a prior question which suggests itself listening to you here, because I mean, throughout the book, you argue, and particularly at the start, you argue against big statery, against Großstaaterei. And I was a little bit in doubt as to whether that referred to something like the EU, something like the United States, or even to something of the size of Germany. I'm not exactly sure what scale we're talking about here. And the question that springs to mind here is, okay, I follow your argument for the revival of nation-state democracy, but my understanding is that would entail an integrated and somewhat centralized nation-state of whatever size it might be, whether it's Slovenia or it's India, that nevertheless it's a centralized and integrated nation-state. And that would be the proper counter to globalist tendencies. But hearing your argument here right from the start, you seem to be suggesting something else, that we should always go to an even lower level, that we should opt for a more federalized state, solve things at a local level if possible, and so on. So I want to understand if your argument is let's go to the lowest level possible whenever presented with a challenge, or whether it really should be the nation state, an integrated, centralized nation state.
Yeah, it's a very Catholic idea, so subsidiarity. But no, in the real world, constitutions are written at the level of nation states, and if you want devolution or decentralization as an intuition that there might be something better than under present conditions, then that is also a national political problem. If you came to the conclusion that a country like Brazil would be better off if the individual states had more capacity to make their own choices, then you have to change the national constitution. And these. I also would think that yes, of course, I'm a European, and I know this European Union thing relatively well. Now 27, few years earlier, 28 states. When I grew up, it was 5.5 states. The half was West Germany. And as a sociologist, I know that a very important characteristic of a social structure is its size. Yeah, and I was in the 1980s very much in favor of what I then thought was a social democratic project at the level of the European Union, which would have been able to contain anti-social democratic processes at the national level in several countries. It later turned out that the opposite was the case, that at some stage in the early 1990s, the European Union became a driving force in the neoliberalization of the European political economy for reasons that we can describe and understand. But they were part of this universalistic idea. Here's an example of what nation states can do to themselves, so to speak. When they rewrote the treaty, they keep rewriting treaties. Now they don't because they know it would not fly in several countries. When they last rewrote the treaty, they had this thing like one paragraph. Number one, complete mobility of capital among the countries of the Union. So, like one. And then number two, the same applies to the external relations of the European. In that moment, the capital markets of United Europe turned into the capital markets of the United World. Where are these capital markets? They basically, we all know where they are. And that was sort of, to me, the first step towards 2008. Yeah, this sort of very strange identity of liberalization and centralization, of a unification from below, and the grabbing of power by the largest unit in this thing, under the rubrum of global happiness and governance.
So I guess the follow-on to that is, how much of the argument they present in the book, an argument about the EU specifically and against the centralization within the EU, an argument for a more pluralistic political approach in which each can pursue policies and forms of organization adequate to their polities. And how much is it more generalizable to maybe say middle-sized developing countries? I mean, you mentioned Brazil, but we could think of anything from India to Turkey, whatever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is the issue here EU-style economic constitutionalism, or is it globalism? And to what extent are they comparable problems, or the same problem, perhaps, or are they separate things?
Yeah, we're now talking about the sort of, I don't want to call it hopes, but potential avenues that one could suggest at a moment in which the present order has become so destabilized that both the rulers can't rule it anymore, and the ruled don't want to be ruled by them. Yeah, the Lenin idea of a revolutionary moment. The rulers can't rule anymore, and the ruled don't want to be ruled. And then my question in the book is, what should we think about in such a moment? And I do believe that a future world cannot be or has to. Yeah. Why this thing with decentralism? I do have this, if you want, this slightly entrepreneurialist thing that if you give people a chance to actually do something for themselves, they will do something constructive. You have to give them the means to think about their situation, and then they will, and then they will be smart enough to see what opportunities there are for them given their condition. And I mean, is that so totally unrealistic? No, we see places that were very poor, and after some time of effort, improve. Denmark was a case. There was an interesting case after they lost the war against Germany, I think against Prussia, in 1860 such and such. What did they do? one of the things they did was they started a huge vocational training program. Then, because they knew we can do something for ourselves if we have the skills, something like that. I'm not selling recipes, but I'm selling this sort of hope that if you give people a chance, they can make something out of it. But in order for them to have the chance, you have to decouple them from all sorts of. For example, I'm not a specialist in banking and money. My university in Wisconsin, where I was a professor for 7 or 8 years, they had a credit union. I was astonished. I didn't know anything about it, but it was a cooperative. It's a cooperative thing where the members sort of have a word. They can have a voice, and more rediscovery of what one can call cooperative traditions, non-capitalist forms of enterprise, local collective goods. What else can I say? If you want to ask me where could be something good, then I would say look in this direction.
I've got a couple of questions about your characterization of the current moment, your
Yeah.
politics of scale. Perhaps want to kind of push you a bit on your characterization here. So, firstly, is it really true that populists today are trying to restore the national scale of governance?
Yeah.
It seems to me, and we've discussed it many times on this podcast, that Europe's right-wing populists have given up on challenging the EU, and they've basically adopted the position of the British left during the Brexit Civil War, which is remain in reform. So they're kind of making their peace, it seems to me. And then related to that is it really true that the globalist supranational ambitions are over? So in chapter 8, I think you're quite you're convincing that the EU is not going to create a fiscal union anytime soon. But you mentioned various proposals, including from the dreaded Jürgen Habermas, for example, to enhance European unity through militarism, a European army, European defence industry, and so on. And again, it seems to me that is the road that the globalists are trying to take Europe down, towards Europe being a militarised bloc with securitised external economic relations. And that also seems to be somewhat to intersect with what the bloc's right-wing populists seem to want. So is it really as simple as globalists want to go upwards and populists want to bring downwards?
No, it's not that simple. But you have to look at. I slightly disagree with your hunch, which might be right, but on the militarization of the European Union as the next path to unification. The European the story about the European Union is a complicated one, because member states in part benefit from the union, and in part are very subversive when it comes to them not being the beneficiary, and each of them plays their own game. It's also a game of sort of pushing problems into the future. These people know that you can sort of locate problems in Brussels. In 5 years, you're retired, and then someone else can take care of them. Yes, yeah, they use Europe as an excuse with their electorate. All of this, but today they now have these grandiose plans of basically, I think, taking the American role in the Ukrainian war and using this for a huge both unification and rearmament process. The moment this will arrive at the bottom, where people actually have to go to war, I think that thing will break down in the same way in which the recovery fund after COVID, 750 billion euros borrowed by the European Union, which is now not allowed to make debt, to take up debt, and it's been running for 3 or 4 years now. You don't see anything. The idea was to jack up the Italian economy and the Spanish economy. Nothing, because even with this thing, you cannot, I think, from the center impose on these countries things that do not fit with their population. So yes, and these right-wing populists, they do different things in different countries. They have tell me what their economic policy is. It's different from place to place. Tell me what their foreign policy is. It is very different from France to Hungary, for example. You have to look at these things in detail. And I think in the same way in which centralization failed again and again and again since the introduction of the euro, it will again sort of fail in the Habermasian militaristic unification program. It was very interesting that when Habermas, together with Merz, who is now German Chancellor, I think 7 or 8 years ago, urged for a European army. Yeah. I was shocked to read this. And in this thing, they say, of course, Russia doesn't have to be afraid because United Kingdom, France, Germany, and 2 or 3 others together spend 5 times as much on their military as Russia does. Yeah, that it was simply in order to for unification for its own purpose, and now von der Leyen has sort of learned or taken this up. But I think this will be so. For example, the Scholz 2 weeks after the Russian invasion, when he announced the Zeitenwende in this Bundestag speech, 100 million euros for the Bundeswehr. If you now look at what they actually spend, I think it's 40% of it, because they don't know how to spend it, and all these arms manufacturers from America, from other countries, they are also lining up, and they have their lobbyists, and nobody knows what sort of. Now they are happy that the drones are so cheap. We'll see whether this will fly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that puts us in a rather different world to the liberal international order that we've known for the past 30 years, even though that's a term that you say you prefer not to use to avoid any confusion. But indeed, I mean, this more militarized Europe is certainly a different beast. And I think we should maybe come on to that in a second. But I did want to maybe take the opportunity to ask, because Lee has already noted the way that Europe's right-wing populists have given up on their sovereigntist ambitions, such as they were. In any case, it seems more like left-wing populists, who would be more in line with your vision, would be, in theory, better placed to exploit the dual crisis of capitalist growth and of democracy more effectively. So, I mean, what is your take on why that hasn't happened? And perhaps if I can suggest, it seems that we could maybe even deal with this in 2 phases. I mean, the period of the 2010s, particularly 2015 to 2019, which is a period really of revolt, and then the period following the pandemic since then. And I think it might be worth thinking of those in 2 different moments.
Yeah, it is very hard to generalize here, but in many countries, the left has sort of continued or was seduced to take part in this identity politics game. And in, for example, in the German left, Linkspartei, at some stage, there was interest in demands for social policy, higher pensions, and all of this. But the idea that there was something generally wrong with the capitalist order, and that order was in a general crisis, that was not very welcome there. They had sort of different concerns. Now, I would think that, and if you allow me to say that, it's sort of a little far-fetched, but real change will come from people on the ground who are not yet organized in any political stream, when they begin to feel that the life that this society is offering them has become too dangerous and is no longer the life that they want to live. Putting it like this, you need to have a level of there is a high level of discontent, which is not always visible. They try to revise or reform the pension system. That's something that is absolutely electrical. Yeah, family life. In this country, people are now telling the opinion research people who come to interview them that the way, if you have children and if you're a single mother and you just cannot work as much as you have to work in order to be able to raise these children decently. Yeah, you need a public transportation system. You need this. You need that. You need training, and so it is a way of life that has become very, very, very hard to live. The family structures are changing. The public provision on the countryside is absolutely changing, and I think if people begin to be deeply enough dissatisfied, then the political elites will have to. There will be no political elites. They will have to think about something serious. Is success in our sense guaranteed? Not at all. Not at all. All sorts of stupidities can happen. We see this. We see it in the United States.
So, I mean, I would maybe take the opportunity to mention, I think one of the fascinating parts of the book, although it's a small part of it, relates to this question of motivational crisis in
Yeah.
capitalism. And you note, I think, that the dawning suspicion that the limits to growth in a capitalist accumulation economy might have drawn nearer combines for more and more people with the sense that living and working are getting ever more burdensome and life ever more restless and insecure. And I mean, I think that's clear, and I think people seem increasingly torn, or they exist in a situation of being pushed and pulled one way and the other between a kind of energetic but desperate entrepreneurialism, and on the other hand, a kind of disconsolate desire or urge to drop out. And I think that tension is being played out in a quite strong way. I think it's the kind of civic privatism that underpins the social peace that still exists is then put in question, and indeed you've been putting into question just now and in the book. So my question relates firstly to that, but also, and maybe more specifically, with regard to how that intersects with formal politics, insofar as the last time that I think we had a wave of dissatisfaction manifesting itself politically, which was throughout the middle of the 2010s, particularly in Europe, it was quite quickly recuperated in some ways by both the populist right and the populist left. And we know that both of those avenues have failed. I mean, we've just been talking about the ways that both of those have not led to any break with the EU, to a kind of return to nation state democracy, as you refer to it. So how and I think I agree with you. I'm sympathetic to the notion that any solution will come from the people themselves rather than from the existing institutionalized forms of politics, left and right, that currently exist. I think I agree with you. So I guess how do you see that playing out in such a way that it would avoid this sort of recuperation by the institutional forces of left and right?
That's a question. And as you see, the powers that be are not completely stupid. This war thing in my country, even worse. The capacity to impose complete silence on this society when it comes to the genocide that is taking place before our eyes, in Palestine or wherever you ever want to call it, and the amount of how people can be scared, not even to talk about it. How you can an entire generation of young journalists. If you know German, you must, and you read the newspapers. No article on Gaza that does not begin with a reference to October 7 and the barbaric action of Hamas. It is impossible to write about Gaza without mentioning the way. I can only say that these young people who are doing this reporting, what they are learning is that a good reporter, a good journalist, sort of observes the limits put to the media by the Staatsräson, by the raison d'etat. That's what they learn. Yeah, and they seem to be following what they are being told. One hears that there's not in Germany, whenever there is a little earthquake somewhere in East India, the news the daily news, they will give you an account where you can donate money for the victims. I've never seen anything. I've never seen any of our charity organizations to collect collect money for Gaza. Yeah. The Germans are sort of world champions per capita in donating money for things happening anywhere in the world, not there. Yeah. They are all afraid of their bank accounts being listed somewhere.
Hello, listener to BungaCast. I hope you're enjoying this interview with Wolfgang Streeck. The final part of it concerns the possibility of national autonomy, the shadow of war, and the role of American unipolarity and its end. Then in the after-party, Lee and I debate this question of federalism and small states. We look deeper into what is the national interest and re-examine the redefinition of democracy. To have access to all of that, you'll have to subscribe to BungaCast. That's at patreon.com/BungaCast, where you'll find this episode in full. And if you like this episode, tell your friends.